Welcome to Discover Cape. Discover Cape is a 30-minute program that will introduce you to fascinating people and take you to interesting and important places. This month, we take an historic look at some very significant and important places to our region. We'll visit the Red House Interpretive Center, tour Old Lorimer Cemetery, and view one of the greatest collections of statuary from the 1904 World's Fair, which happens to be located on the campus of Southeast Missouri State. So stay tuned for this historic episode of Discover Cape. This show is sponsored in part by Ameren.
You won't find these highlights on any sports network. Tonight, no medals will be handed out and no trophies to hoist. These are not made for TV games, but when you've got a deep freeze full of 16-ounce ribeyes, pork roasts, and venison sausage, you'll be cheering them on nonetheless. After all, in the untelevised wake of the storm, there's much more at stake than frozen steaks.
Things can get pretty ugly when you're bored. In an after-school program, you can find something way better to do.
St. Louis was host to the 1904 World's Fair, considered by some to be one of the most significant events of the 20th century. Scott Hugerich, a Southeast graduate, directed a multiple award-winning documentary on the World's Fair. We talked with Scott and Dr. Stanley Grand, director of the University Museum, on the significance of the fair and the university's collection of statuary.
The idea of doing a documentary about the World's Fair came about from another project that I was working on in 2002. I was producing a gratis video to help restore the Grand Basin, which is the lake at the bottom of Art Hill in Forest Park, and that was part of the World's Fair. At any rate, through the course of that production, I needed some footage of the World's Fair, and I went to the Missouri Historical Society and got some footage, and the tape that they gave me was on a 3/4-inch video cassette, and I knew immediately that we at least needed to transfer it to a digital tape format so that it would at least be preserved a little bit longer. And after we did that, we sort of kicked around the idea of what we could do with it since it's transferred to digital now, and then that's how the idea of doing a full-blown documentary came about. So a lot of St. Louisans have a passion for the fair, and they're fairly well knowledgeable about different aspects about the fair. One thing that we found out throughout the course of our research was how important it was for the United States. We were just entering the 20th century at that point, and America still wasn't a world power. And what the U.S. government did is they used the fair to showcase to the rest of the world that we were an emerging power, that our culture was advancing, that we could keep up with Europe in terms of the arts and things of that nature.
It was one of the most extravagant exhibitions. It was not just a show, it was also to showcase scientific discoveries. And countries from all over the world brought various products, skills, industries, etc. And August Gerber of Cologne, Germany, was a manufacturer of statues of classical and also modern works of art. These statues behind me were manufactured by him in Cologne, Germany. So his statues were part of an exhibit of German industries. Initially, it was an anonymous gift, and the earliest reports simply say that the donation was made by a friend of the school. But subsequently, Louis Houck was identified. As he toured the exhibits, he saw August Gerber's display of reproduction sculptures, and at the end of the fair, he purchased them from Mr. Gerber, and it was on the condition that Gerber come down to Cape Girardeau and personally install them in Academic Hall, which was being completed in 1905, and installed there in Statuary Hall. When the statues were removed from Academic Hall, they were dispersed over the campus because of space needs in Academic Hall. Some of the pieces, especially this piece of Hebe, who's holding a small little, like a little bowl, that was used as an ashtray, and you can still see little cigarette burns, and even though it had been restored, they have now come through. Figures that were topless, well, you can imagine what students might do. Well, when they first come into the museum, they're greeted with about 35, 40 statues, which range in scale from over life size, like some of the works directly behind me, to small little heads that are about 7 or 8 inches in height. There is the Venus de Milo, which is directly behind me. That was discovered in the first half of the 19th century. So it really would have been a relatively new find, maybe 75 years old at the time of the fair. And it was seen in many ways as the answer to the British classical collection of antiquities from the Parthenon, in that France did not have anything that was comparable. This particular statue was really seen as a tremendous response to the Brits who had the Elgin marbles. There's also a wonderful statue by Donatello of St. George, and it is one of the early masterpieces of the Italian Renaissance. One of the things that was particularly remarkable was the infusion of personality that Donatello added to the statue. And you can see that in his sort of furrowed brow, as if he is looking out. His legs are spread. He is solidly awaiting whatever might come and endanger Florence. He is watchful, he is vigilant, and really concentrating. And the original was in Florence at a famous church called Or San Michele. And everybody would pretty much agree that that was one of the great achievements of the early Renaissance. There is also a wonderful statue from the Strasbourg Cathedral called Synagogue. And the thing I think that's interesting about it is that it dates from the 13th century, but it is very much political or propagandistic art. It was balanced by the church, and as you can see when you look at the work, the synagogue is represented, number one, as blindfolded, and number two, her staff is broken. And the point was that the old religion of the Hebrews has now been replaced by the new religion, Christianity, and everyone who walked through the transept door would see that message loud and clear. I don't know the future of this collection. I do think that it is an essential part of this university's heritage, that when the decision was made to rebuild after the devastating fire of 1902, which destroyed the main academic building. And a decision was made to rebuild on the same site, but a completely different type of building, as really marking a major transition in the university. And an essential part of that vision is this group of Statuary, which very much does harken back to the classical tradition and is a part of that sort of humanistic tradition that is so much an important aspect of Western thought and belief.
For more information on the world's greatest fair, visit www.theworldsgreatestfair.com.
As forecasted, in rolls the archenemy, cumulonimbus behemoths, spilling torrents, and crackling flashes in the night, humbling Dobermans and tumbling oak trees. But in the real world, there is no hall of justice, just a legion of men and women who've traded in their capes and hero mobiles for canvas coveralls and bucket trucks.
You have the right to remain silent.
You have the right to be heard.
Anything you say can't be used
What you say will be listened to with dignity and respect. You have the right to information and assistance. Justice isn't served until crime victims are.
They've stormed beaches and freed countries. Protected the weak and defeated the strong. Shown courage and compassion. They've raised our flag and our hope. They've been called leathernecks. They've been called devil dogs. But above all, they're called Marines.
The Red House Interpretive Center commemorates the visit of Lewis and Clark in November 1803. Louis Lorimer, Cape Girardeau's founder, welcomed the expedition members at his home, the Red House. The Interpretive Center houses an early 1800s exhibit that reflects the lives of the early settlers of the old Cape Girardeau district.
My name is Jane Randall Jackson, and I'm the chairman of the Red House Interpretive Center. And I arrange for programming for the Red House and fundraising, and I docent. I do a lot of things. Back in 1999, we learned that Lewis and Clark had been in this area, and the state of Missouri was working on signage panels all up and down the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers to mark the spots that Lewis and Clark stopped. So we attended a meeting, three of us, Dr. Frank Nickel, Linda Nash, and I. And at the end of that meeting, we determined that we needed to do something locally to commemorate Lewis and Clark's stop here on November 23rd, 1803. So that we started speaking to groups, service clubs, give them their idea. We went before the city council, told them our idea, and eventually the house came into being. We ended up receiving $103,000 in grants from the Missouri Department of Transportation and the Missouri Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Commission, and donations of over $30,000 from local citizens, and untold amounts of materials, and all of the labor was donated to build the building. So by November 23rd, 2003, we had the Red House here, and the Red House is a reproduction. It's not an original building. It's a reproduction of the home that Lewis Lorimer lived in before he died in 1812. And this was the house that Meriwether Lewis had dinner in on November 23rd, 1803. We decided, as part of the reason we should commemorate Lewis and Clark stopping here, we had three goals. One was an archaeological dig, which hasn't yet come to fruition. The second was building the Red House Interpretive Center, so it would commemorate the home that Lewis Lorimer lived in, who was the founder of the city of Cape Girardeau. And then the third goal was to do a reenactment of the day Lewis and Clark came. We achieved the reenactment. We worked with the Corps of Discovery when they came through. We had over 3,000 people visit us and be in the area that weekend. But now then the Red House is here to help people understand the history and what life was like in 1803 when Lewis and Clark came through.
The blankets you see on the wall behind you are worth 4 beaver pelts, so the four little chutes or lines you see above the big line. So just think it'd take 16 to 40 deer pelts to equal the price of one blanket. That's a lot of hunting. Whereas people mostly trap the beaver, though it's a little bit easier to procure the beavers through trapping. The beaver pelts went to Europe in bundles of hundreds of thousands, from which they would shave the fur off and beat it with mercury compounds on tables with a big wooden bat and turn it into a fabric called felt. And from that, they would make that into beaver skin hats.
We have hanging over in the corner clothing that would have been worn around the 1803, 1806 era. We have the everyday dress, we have the military dress, and we also have the woodsman dress. Notice that the shoes at the bottom are wooden shoes. That was a popular shoe to have back then, and they still wear them today and in different parts of the world. They would put on the shoes whenever they went outside, or they had to go work in the garden, or had to go to a function somewhere. They would put on their wooden shoes, and of course it's probably the most waterproof shoe you could find. They would take their good shoes with them, and whenever they went to their place of destination, they would change into their good shoes.
The project is entirely done by volunteers. We had over 200 people work over 6,500 hours to actually get the house built. We had local companies contribute materials and manpower. The list is huge. I couldn't possibly go over the whole list, but the city of Cape Girardeau donated the property, and then we started building, and then the house came up, and we have this beautiful building that everybody can visit now. It's a French colonial style building, and it's the work of many hands, so a lot of people in the local area, including Jackson, and in Illinois. There were some people from Southern Illinois who came over, and Advance who worked on it. People all over the area came and helped. We chose this spot because it's just across the street from the original location of the Red House. The original house was on the parking lot of Old St. Vincent's Church, just across the street. And when we started the project, the city said, well, we like your idea, and we have a piece of property on the other side of the street from the original location. What would you think about building there? And we said, that's perfect. You know, you're just across the street. So the location was chosen because it's so near to the original spot. We want to use the Red House so that people of all ages can learn about the history of the area. And throughout this year, we have activities going on the porch on a lot of Saturdays, not every Saturday, but a lot of Saturdays. Adults can do a bicentennial book club reading, and the first one will be the first Tuesday in April. We will have a spring and a fall frolic for children, and they can come and play historical games and learn about stuff that happened in the past. We are forming a kids club, Red House Kids Club, and the first one is going to meet on the day, I believe it's April 29th, and we will be learning about Lewis and Clark that day. We will be publishing the dates of all of these events in the newspaper and on the radio, and we were fixing little bookmarks to hand out in the local libraries and the local schools. The Sons of the American Revolution will be here in full dress every first Saturday of the month. They're quite colorful. They're Revolutionary War guys dressed up in their uniforms. One even looks a little bit like George Washington. So it's just a lot of fun, and we dress up in our period dress, and we encourage adults down to any school-age person. We only charge $1 to get in. Adults, we charge $3. If they're a member of the Friends, if they want to join the Friends and help us create our $100,000 a foundation to make sure that the Red House is here for the next 100 years, we would be happy to have them join, and when they do that, they can come to the Red House anytime for free. So we look forward to inviting everyone to come to the Red House. We're open every Saturday from 10 to 4, beginning in March, and our last opening day is the first Saturday in December.
We're standing in Old Lorimer Cemetery today, which, in my view, is the most historic spot in Cape Girardeau.
An industrial symphony of man and machine, growling engines and elbow grease, backup plans and watchful eyes, mountains of fuel, teeming with big yellow brontosaurs that could pick monster trucks out of their teeth, all to make sure the turbines whirl, so the lines buzz, so the night lights of the neighborhood flicker to life when called upon.
New Year's Eve, 2002.
Just 2 years ago.
In the 6th grade.
July 11th, 1994. I was shot by a teenage gang member.
My son Valentino was killed by a drunk driver. My baby brother Joseph was shot.
I was sexually assaulted.
My wife Emma was killed by a drunk driver.
My heart was ripped apart. The day this happened to us, our family died. At that time, I had no idea that I needed help or that my family needed help.
I didn't know help was there.
A detective told us about victims' assistance.
We did receive help with the funeral and burial.
They informed me of my court dates.
They paid for my wheelchair-accessible van.
If you're a victim of crime, seek help because help is there for you.
Even if you never reported the crime.
Crime victims assistance programs are there to help.
Justice isn't served until crime victims are.
To some, cemeteries are not the most inviting places to visit, but historians recognize a cemetery as a reflection of the community's past. The Old Lorimer Cemetery was established in 1808 as a public burial ground and given to the city by Lewis Lorimer, the town's founder.
We're standing in Old Lorimer Cemetery today, which, in my view, is the most historic spot in Cape Girardeau. It's the center of history. It's the most documented area of Cape Girardeau's history. It's the burial place of the founder of Cape Girardeau, Lewis Lorimer, and his wife. A number of famous people, significant people to the development of the town. This was a high hill located north of Cape Girardeau, and Lorimer donated this to the city in perpetuity as a resting place for the town's residents. In 1808, his wife Charlotte died and was brought here to this high hill north of Cape Girardeau. They actually brought her upriver on a boat. Landed on the riverfront. We're about a mile or a mile and a quarter north of Cape Girardeau. They carried her up the low area just behind the cemetery to the south, up the hill, and Lorimer wrote that he returned her to her people. So if you think about this, this has been a burial place for over 200 years. There are about 1,200 tombstones that mark the early settlers and residents of the community. But there may be as many as 9,000 people buried here. And in this community, or in this cemetery, are the founders and the developers of the community. We have not only the Lorimers, but we have a Senator Alexander Buckner, who died in a cholera epidemic in the 1830s. Here is buried Lewis Houck, the historian and economic developer of the community, his family members. Right behind me is the tombstone of Lewis Cheney, the first president of the normal school at Cape Girardeau. And I love this stone because here is a president of the university who was an archaeologist and killed in a cave-in while doing archaeological research. And on his tombstone it simply says, a teacher. Just close to us is the gravestone of Uriah Brock, a Revolutionary War soldier. Just a few feet from us is the second cousin of George Washington, the Lewis family. That family has played an important role in Cape Girardeau's history. Just to the south is the tombstone of Robert Sturtevant, banker, prominent developer, probably the most significant, the costliest tombstone in the cemetery. We have Joseph Landsman, the builder of Old St. Vincent Church, of Common Pleas Courthouse, of the first normal school building on the campus here in Cape Girardeau in 1875. The cemetery tells us a lot about who we are as a community because they separated Protestants from Catholics. In the western part of the cemetery, identified by the crosses and the Catholic markers, is really the Catholic section of the cemetery, separated by an arch and a walkway. Protestants here on the east, Catholics on the west. So they separated individuals in this life in order to promote their separation, I suppose, in the afterlife. Very reflective of the 19th century. If you had visited Old Lorimer Cemetery in the 1880s, this is how much of it would have looked. The stones were close together. There was no empty space in the cemetery in the 1870s and 1880s. The stones simply occupied and filled this spot. Over the years, they have been lost, they've been broken. We have about 1,200 tombstones here. Probably 70% of them have been damaged by vandalism, by trees, by lawnmowers, just by neglect. The cemetery was almost lost. It was overgrown, neglected, abandoned as the city moved to the west and to the south. Here we have a number of individuals who moved on from Cape Girardeau and became famous. Best example of that, in my view, is William Scripps and his consort Grace and their daughter. One of the most unusual stones architecturally in the cemetery. And William Scripps, who moved here from London in 1791. Think about the transition for that individual who moved from London, England, to Cape Girardeau 30 years before this was a state, settled here. His family moved on to Rushville, Illinois, where there is today a Scripps Library, and then to California. And the Scripps family is connected to the Scripps-Howard newspaper and the Scripps Institute of Oceanography in California. So here is a family of great significance to Cape Girardeau and to the nation. The architecture of the tombstones, it reflects the time period in which the burials occurred, and certainly at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, when we were seeing obelisks built nationwide, we have a small obelisk built here in this cemetery. And if you look to the south and to the west, you see a number of obelisks that sort of reflect the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. That's the style they're trying to emulate. These are monuments that are expensive. They were imported, brought in from the East at great cost to the families, but they make a statement. They're pointing to heaven, and that was the style and that was the fashion of the time. It's important for us to maintain and preserve these stones that are left, to maintain the site, the tree, the settings, the overlook of the river. It's such a historic place. It's such a beautiful place. It's a place that tells us who we are as a community.
Thanks for tuning in to this edition of Discover Cape. Each month we will take this journey where there are many places to go, there are many interesting people to meet, and so many new things to discover. Join us again as we discover Cape.